I'm a correctional officer. I have been for 11 years. I work at Ridgemont State Correctional Facility in upstate New York, which was originally built in 1931 as a state reformatory, decommissioned in 1978, partially reopened in 1996 due to overcrowding across the system, and has been running on a skeleton budget and a skeleton crew ever since. If you've never been inside a place like that, I'll tell you right now, it doesn't feel like a building that was meant to be used again. It feels like a building that was left alone long enough to become something else, and then people were put back inside it anyway. The facility has 4 main cell blocks. A through D. A and B are general population. D is administrative segregation. And C, cell block C, had been closed since the reopening. 30 years sealed off behind a set of double fire doors on the east side of the main corridor, past the infirmary, past a janitorial storage area that nobody uses, and through a connecting hallway where half the overhead lights don't work because the wiring was never brought up to code. I'd walked past those fire doors maybe 4,000 times in my career and never thought much about them. They were gray. Scuffed. There was a faded paper sign taped to the left one that said maintenance, no access. Somebody had drawn a smiley face on it in ballpoint pen, which had mostly been rubbed away. You could still see the circle of the head. I never had any reason to think about cell block C at all, until February of last year, when the warden called a shift briefing at the start of third watch, that's 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and told us that due to a transfer surge from 2 downstate facilities, C block was being temporarily reopened for minimum security overflow housing. There were 6 of us on that shift. DeMarco, Harlan, Ostrowski, Kim, a newer officer named Pruitt who had maybe 8 months in, and me. The warden, a man named Colton who I'd always found reasonable, stood at the front of the briefing room with his hands in his pockets and gave us the news with the kind of careful, clipped tone that means the decision was made above his head and he's just delivering it. He said construction had done a walkthrough. Plumbing was functional. Electrical had been partially updated. 42 cells on 2 tiers had been cleared for occupancy. Transfers would begin arriving in 72 hours. Then he paused. Took his hands out of his pockets. Picked up a photocopied sheet from the desk beside him and held it up. C block has supplemental protocols, he said. They're in addition to your standard operating procedures, not a replacement for them. Read them. Follow them. Don't freelance. He handed the sheets out one by one. I remember the paper was warm from the copier. I remember looking at it under the briefing room's fluorescent light and noticing that the header didn't match our facility's standard formatting. There was no department seal, no form number, no revision date. It just said Cell Block C, Supplemental Operational Protocols at the top, in a font I didn't recognize, and below that, a numbered list. I'll tell you what was on the list. I've thought about each item more than I should have. 1. Third watch officers assigned to C block must conduct inmate count every 45 minutes, not every 60. Counts must be logged by hand in the physical ledger located at the C block officer station. Do not rely on electronic count systems for C block. 2. Interior lights in C block corridors remain on at all times. If a corridor light fails, do not enter that corridor. Radio for maintenance and wait at the officer station until the light is restored. Continue counts in lit sections only. 3. Cell doors in C block are manually operated. Do not attempt to use remote release systems. Each cell door must be opened and closed individually by key. Officers must verify closure of each door by hand after locking. 4. Between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., do not conduct count from the upper tier walkway. Conduct count from the ground floor only, using visual confirmation through the tier grating. If visual confirmation is not possible, mark the cell as unverified and flag for first watch follow-up. 5. If an inmate in C block reports hearing sounds from unoccupied cells, log the report, acknowledge the inmate, and do not investigate. File an incident notation and continue normal duties. 6. Officer station camera feeds for C block are recorded but not monitored in real time by Central Operations. Officers assigned to C block are responsible for their own situational awareness. 7. Do not leave the officer station unattended between midnight and 5 a.m. without a partner officer present in C block. If no partner officer is available, remain at the station and conduct counts from the station window. 8. If a cell in C block is found open during count and the occupying inmate is present and asleep, close and lock the cell, log the incident, and do not wake the inmate. 9. Former intake records for cell block C are archived off-site. Do not submit requests for historical inmate records associated with C block through the standard records system. I read the list twice. Looked up. The others were still reading. Pruitt had this look on his face like he was waiting for someone to laugh. Nobody laughed. DeMarco raised his hand. What's this about, Warden? Half of this contradicts SOP. Colton nodded. Like he expected it. The building is old. C block has structural and electrical inconsistencies that make standard procedures unreliable. These protocols compensate for that. Follow them. And number 5. DeMarco said. We're just supposed to ignore sounds from empty cells. Pipes, Colton said. The plumbing in that wing is original. The acoustic properties of the block amplify it. Inmates will hear things. They'll report them. You log it and move on. That's it. Harlan, who had been at Ridgemont longer than anyone, just folded his sheet in half, slid it into his breast pocket, and said nothing. That was a Tuesday. Transfers started arriving Friday. They brought in 31 inmates that first week. Minimum security. Low risk. Short sentences, mostly nonviolent offenses. They were processed through standard intake and escorted to C block by pairs of officers. I wasn't on C block assignment that first rotation. I was on B block, running my usual tier, but I could see the corridor to the east wing from certain points, and I watched the fire doors propped open with rubber wedges, the lights on inside, the sound of voices and footsteps carrying down the hallway for the first time in 3 decades. It looked normal. It sounded normal. It smelled wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. The air that came out of C block, once those fire doors were opened, had a quality to it that I couldn't place. Not rot. Not mold. Not sewage. Something thinner than that. Something dry and faintly metallic, like the air above a photocopier that's been running too long. It wasn't strong. You could ignore it. But every time I passed the east corridor, I noticed it. And every time, I noticed it a little more. I got my first C block assignment 8 days after the transfers arrived. Wednesday night, 3rd watch. Me and Pruitt. The walk from the main corridor to C block takes about 3 minutes if you don't rush. You pass the infirmary, which is dark and locked after 10 p.m., then the janitorial storage area, which always has one fluorescent tube buzzing at a frequency that gets into your back teeth, and then the connecting hallway, where only every third ceiling light works. The hallway is about 40 yards long. Your footsteps echo in a way they don't anywhere else in the facility. The walls are unpainted cinder block, and there's a hairline crack that runs along the right side at about shoulder height for the entire length, like the building is split. At the end of the hallway, you hit the fire doors, and then you're in C block. I want to describe it carefully because it matters. C block is shaped differently from the others. A, B, and D are all standard linear designs, 2 rows of cells facing each other across a central corridor, 2 tiers, catwalks above, officer stations at the entrance. C block is radial. The cells are arranged in a curve, following the shape of the original reformatory wing, which was built as a half-moon. There are 2 tiers, like the others, but because of the curve, you can't see both ends of the block from any single point. You can stand at the officer station, which is positioned at the center of the arc, and see maybe 20 cells in either direction. Beyond that, the block bends away from you. There are blind spots built into the architecture. The first thing I noticed was the light. Every corridor light was on, per protocol, but the fixtures were old, caged industrial bulbs, not the flat fluorescent panels they'd installed in the other blocks during renovation. The light they gave off was yellowish and uneven. It pooled in some areas and thinned in others. The upper-tier walkway was dimmer than the ground floor because several of the fixtures up there were angled wrong, pointing at the ceiling instead of the corridor. The second thing I noticed was the sound. Or rather, the quality of the sound. In B block, at night, there's always ambient noise. Coughing. Someone's TV on low. A toilet flushing. Snoring that carries through the vents. The building makes sounds that you stop hearing after a while because they're constant, the HVAC system, the hum of the electrical panels, the distant clang of the kitchen's walk-in cooler compressor cycling on and off. C block was quieter. Not silent, I could hear inmates breathing, someone shifting on a bunk, the occasional murmur, but the background noise was different. Thinner. The HVAC didn't seem to reach that wing with the same pressure. The air barely moved. And underneath everything, there was a sound I could only hear when I held my breath. A very faint, rhythmic ticking that didn't match any clock. It was irregular. Almost like a heartbeat, but uneven. Sometimes it would skip. Sometimes it would double up. It was coming from somewhere inside the walls. I told myself it was the plumbing. That's what Colton said. Old pipes expanding and contracting. Reasonable. I wrote it off. Pruitt and I set up at the officer station. It was a caged-in desk at the center of the arc, with a window on 3 sides that gave you a partial view of both tiers. There was a logbook, a physical one, 3-ring binder, lined paper, the kind of thing I hadn't used since I started, and a set of keys on a retractable lanyard bolted to the desk. There was a small bank of 4 monitors showing camera feeds. The image quality was poor. Grainy. The cameras were old models, and 2 of the 4 feeds had a persistent flicker, like the signal was being interrupted at regular intervals. 11:47 p.m. First count. I took the ground floor. Pruitt took the clipboard. I walked the curve, left to right, cell by cell. Manual count means you stop at each door, look through the observation slot, verify a living body, and move on. It takes longer than electronic count. It's tedious. It's also more intimate. You're standing 2 feet from a sleeping human being, listening to them breathe, watching the blanket rise and fall, and then you're moving to the next one, and the next. 31 occupied cells. 31 confirmed. I walked back to the station and Pruitt logged it. Quiet, he said. Yeah. It's weird, right? How quiet? Old wing. Thick walls. He nodded. Didn't look convinced. 12:32 a.m. Second count. Same route. Same result. 31 confirmed. I noticed, on this pass, that the ticking inside the walls was slightly louder near cells 14 through 18, which were on the inner curve, closest to what I assumed was a plumbing riser. I paused at cell 16 and listened. The sound was clearer there. Not ticking, exactly. More like tapping. Like someone dragging a fingernail slowly across the inside of a pipe at uneven intervals. The inmate in 16 was asleep. Facing the wall. Blanket pulled up to his chin. I kept moving. 1:17 a.m. Third count. 31 confirmed. But this time, as I passed cell 23, the inmate, a guy named Vasquez, early 30s, in on a DUI sentence, was sitting up on his bunk. Eyes open. Looking at me through the slot. Hey, I said. Low. Professional. Everything all right? There's someone in the cell next to me, he said. 24. I checked my roster. That's inmate Morales. No. 22. I looked at my clipboard. Cell 22 was unoccupied. 22 is empty, I said. Nobody's in there. Then why is someone talking? I stood in front of cell 22. I looked through the observation slot. The cell was dark, no overhead light because no inmate was assigned, which meant no reason to activate the fixture. The bunk was bare. Steel frame, no mattress. Steel toilet, steel sink, nothing else. I listened. Nothing. Just the ambient whisper of air barely moving through the vent and that faint ticking sound, which I realized I could now hear from here too, even though I was well past the section near the plumbing riser. I don't hear anything, I said. Old building. Sound carries weird in here. Try to get some sleep. Vasquez didn't lie down. He just looked at me for a long moment, then looked at the wall between his cell and 22, then looked back at me. He lay down slowly, still facing the wall. I walked back to the station. Took out the supplemental protocol sheet from my pocket. Number 5. If an inmate reports hearing sounds from unoccupied cells, log the report, acknowledge the inmate, and do not investigate. I logged it. Time, cell, inmate name, nature of report. Sounds from unoccupied cell. Advised inmate. No further action. Pruitt was watching me write. What was that? Vasquez says he hears someone talking in 22. 22's empty. I know. Pruitt looked at the protocol sheet on the desk. Looked at me. That's what number 5 is for, isn't it? I didn't answer that. I didn't want to think about the fact that whoever wrote these protocols had anticipated this specific complaint, from this specific kind of situation, with enough confidence to build a procedure around it. 2 a.m. Per protocol, no upper tier count. Ground floor visual through the grating only. I stood beneath the upper tier and looked up through the metal mesh walkway, trying to identify shapes in the cells above. The light was worse up there than I'd initially thought. Several cells were deep enough that the bunk was outside the angle of illumination from the corridor fixture. I could confirm occupancy in about half the upper tier cells. The rest I marked unverified. Pruitt was at the station, watching the camera monitors. I came back and sat down. "Hey," he said. "Come look at this." He pointed at monitor 3. It showed the upper tier, east curve, the far end of the block, where the architecture bends away from the station and out of direct sight. The image was grainy, as always, but I could see the walkway, the cell doors, the railing. All normal. "Watch," Pruitt said. He pointed at a spot near the edge of the frame, just before the corridor curved out of the camera's view. I watched for 10 seconds. 20. The image flickered. Not the whole screen, just that section. A brief visual stutter, like a single frame had been removed and replaced. And in that flicker, for maybe a quarter of a second, there was something in the corridor that hadn't been there before. A shape. Upright. Roughly the height and width of a person standing against the far wall. Then the image stabilized, and the corridor was empty again. "Did you see it?" Pruitt asked. "Compression artifact," I said. "These cameras are 20 years old. The signal degrades." It looked like someone standing there. "It's a visual glitch. It happens on old CCTV systems." Pruitt didn't push it. He was new enough to still defer. But he kept watching the monitor for the next several minutes, and I noticed he pulled his chair slightly closer to the desk, away from the window that faced the east curve. I want to be clear about something. I am not a person who is prone to imagining things. 11 years in corrections will cure you of whatever tendency you had toward magical thinking. You learn to read environments for real threats, inmate behavior, body language, patterns of movement that precede violence. You learn to trust what you see and hear and verify, and to disregard everything else. I was not afraid of C-block. I was not unsettled by Vasquez's complaint or the camera flicker. I was doing my job, following the protocols, and maintaining composure, because that's what the job is. But I will tell you that at 2:34 a.m., sitting at the officer station in cell block C, I became aware of something that I could not explain and have not been able to explain since. I was writing in the logbook. Pruitt was to my left, reading something on his phone under the desk where he thought I couldn't see. The block was still. No movement on any camera feed. No sounds from any cell. And then, from somewhere on the upper tier, at the far east end of the curve, the section I could not see from the station, I heard a cell door close. Not slam. Close. The heavy, deliberate sound of a steel door being swung shut on its hinges and seated into the frame. That sound is unmistakable to anyone who works in a prison. It's percussive and final. It has weight. Pruitt heard it too. His head came up. His phone disappeared. What was that? I was already looking at the monitors. Camera 3 showed the upper east corridor, same as before. Empty. Camera 4, which covered the upper west curve, also showed nothing. The image quality was too poor to see individual cell doors clearly, but there was no movement on either feed. "Wind," I said. I didn't believe it. There was no wind in C block. The air barely moved. I looked at the protocol sheet again. Item number 4. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., do not conduct count from the upper tier walkway. I followed the protocol. I didn't go up. I sat at the station and I listened, and for the next 20 minutes, I heard nothing else. The block returned to its strange, compressed silence, and the ticking in the walls continued at its irregular pace, and Pruitt and I looked at each other a couple of times but neither of us said anything worth logging. 2:45 a.m. count. Ground floor only, per protocol. 31 confirmed on the lower tier. Upper tier visual through the grating, 11 confirmed, 6 unverified. I noticed, during this count, that Vasquez in 23 was awake again. Sitting up. Not looking at me this time. Looking at the ceiling. I stopped at his slot. Vasquez. He didn't respond immediately. Then, without lowering his gaze, it stopped. What stopped? The talking. In 22. It stopped about 10 minutes ago. Good. Get some rest. It didn't stop because nobody's there, he said. It stopped because it heard you coming. I logged it. Continued count. Return to station. 3:30 a.m. count. Same results. The block was still. But something had changed, and it took me almost the full length of my walk to identify what it was. The ticking was gone. The sound that had been constant since I arrived, that low, irregular, inside the walls tapping, had stopped completely. The block was more silent than any space I've ever been in inside a correctional facility. It was the kind of silence that has texture. The kind that makes you aware of the blood moving through your own ears. I stood at the station and tried to hear it again. Nothing. Just the barely perceptible movement of air through vents that barely worked, and the hum of the monitors, and Pruitt breathing through his mouth because he had a deviated septum he'd never gotten fixed. 3:31 a.m. The logbook was open on the desk. I had just written the time and count totals. My pen was still touching the paper. And I saw that the page before my current entry, the one I'd written my 2:45 count on, had additional writing on it. Below my entry, in handwriting that was not mine and not Pruitt's, someone had written a single line. 31 + 1. I stared at it. I looked at Pruitt. He was watching camera 2. He hadn't touched the logbook. I had been the only one writing in it all night. The binder had been in front of me at the station, within arm's reach, for the entire shift. Pruitt. Did you write in the logbook? No. Why? Come here. He leaned over. Saw the entry. His face did something I've only seen on very new officers when they realize a situation is real and not a drill. A kind of quiet recalibration. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. That's not my writing, he said. I know. That's not your writing either. I know. We stood there, both looking at it. The handwriting was small and precise. The ink was the same color as what was in my pen, black, but the stroke weight was different. Thinner. Like a finer point. There was no other pen at the station. 31 + 1. 31 inmates. +1. I picked up the radio. Control, this is Officer Hadley, C Block Station. Requesting a partner unit for an unscheduled upper-tier sweep. Static. Then, C Block, Control. Your block is 2 officer tonight. What's the nature of the request? Possible unauthorized presence. Upper tier, East Section. A pause. Longer than it should have been. C Block, stand by. I stood by. Pruitt was staring at the monitor showing the Upper East Corridor. I was watching too. The image flickered in its usual pattern, that rhythmic stutter every 40 seconds or so. But this time, between the flickers, I was looking more carefully. I was looking at the cell doors. And I saw that one of them was open. Upper tier. East curve. Near the far end, just before the corridor bent out of frame. A cell door, slightly ajar. Maybe 4 inches. The gap was barely visible on the grainy feed, but it was there, a thin black line where the door didn't meet the frame. I couldn't tell the cell number from the camera angle. But I knew that section of the upper tier. Those cells were unoccupied. No inmates had been assigned above cell 31. The upper east curve was empty. Control, this is Hadley. I have a visual on what appears to be an open cell door, upper tier east. Unoccupied section. Requesting immediate support. C block, be advised, per supplemental protocol, upper tier access is restricted between 0200 and 0400. Maintain station. First watch will conduct a physical check at 0500. Control, I have a possible intruder indication. I need. Hadley. Maintain station. Acknowledge. I acknowledged. I set the radio down. Pruitt was looking at me with an expression that was no longer just recalibration. It was the beginning of something I recognized from my own early years. The moment you understand that the institution you work for has already made a decision about what you're going to do, and that decision has nothing to do with what makes sense. We just sit here, he said. We sit here. There's someone up there. Maybe. The logbook. I know. We sat there. I watched the monitor. The cell door remained open. The image flickered at its regular interval. Every time the flicker happened, I held my breath, waiting to see if the shape would appear again, the upright figure Pruitt had spotted earlier, standing in the corridor. It didn't appear. Not on camera. But at 3:48 a.m., I heard footsteps on the upper tier. Not inmate footsteps. Inmates in C block wore soft-soled slides that made a shuffling sound on the concrete. These footsteps were deliberate and evenly spaced, like someone walking a patrol route. They came from the east end of the upper tier, the section I could not see, and moved slowly toward the center. They stopped directly above the officer station. I looked up. The ceiling of the station cage was solid, steel plate with acoustic tiles above it. I couldn't see the upper walkway from inside the cage. But I could hear, with absolute clarity, someone standing directly over my head. Pruitt had stopped breathing. I could hear that, too. The footsteps resumed. They moved away from the station, toward the west curve, getting fainter. Then they stopped again. Then silence. I looked at the monitors. Camera 1 covered the upper west corridor. It showed an empty walkway. No figure. No movement. I looked at camera 3. Upper east. The cell door that had been open was now closed. I did not go up to the upper tier. I followed the protocol. I sat at the station and I did my 415 count from the ground floor and confirmed 31, and I marked 11 upper tier cells as unverified, and I wrote it all in the logbook in handwriting that I made sure was mine. At 5 a.m., first watch arrived. 2 officers, Briggs and Caputo, came through the fire doors looking rested and bored and holding coffee. I briefed them. Told them about the open cell door on camera, the footsteps, the logbook entry. Briggs looked at the page. Looked at me. Happens, he said. What do you mean, happens? In C block. Things like this happen. You follow the protocols, you log it, you go home. That's it. Briggs. Someone was walking around up there. He took a slow sip of his coffee. Set the cup down. Hadley. I've been on C block rotation for 4 months. First watch, every Wednesday and Thursday. I've read every logbook entry since they reopened this wing. You want to know what I've found? I waited. Every third watch officer logs the same things. Sounds from empty cells. The ticking in the walls. Footsteps on the upper tier between 2 and 4. The logbook entries that nobody wrote. It's all in there. Every shift. Every week. Same pattern. And nobody's done anything about it. He looked at me like I'd asked why water was wet. What would you do about it? You saw the camera feed. Nothing's there. You heard the footsteps. Nobody's there. The logbook entry, nobody wrote it. There's nothing to do, Hadley. That's what the protocols are for. They're not telling you how to deal with the problem. They're telling you how to be in the same building as the problem without the problem getting worse. Worse how? Briggs didn't answer that. He opened the logbook to a fresh page, wrote the date, and started his first count. I left. Pruitt and I walked back through the connecting hallway in silence. The fluorescent tube in the janitorial closet was still buzzing. The crack in the wall was still there. The air still had that faint metallic scent, but it was thinner now, barely detectable, like whatever produced it was less active during daylight hours. We clocked out. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before driving home. Pruitt sat in his car next to mine. Neither of us pulled out first. I think we were both doing the same thing, sitting in a small, enclosed space that belonged to us, where we controlled the locks and the lights, and trying to feel like that was enough. I did 4 more C block rotations over the next 2 months. I'll tell you about them briefly, because the details matter less than the pattern. Second rotation. A Thursday. My partner was Kim. The ticking was present when we arrived and stopped at approximately 2:10 a.m. Inmate Morales in 24 reported hearing what he described as counting from the unoccupied cell across from him. When I asked him what he meant, he said someone was reciting numbers in a whisper. Not in order. Random numbers, repeated. He said it had been going on for an hour. I logged it per protocol. Kim and I heard footsteps on the upper tier at 3:22 a.m. They followed the same pattern, east to center, pause above the station, then west and gone. The logbook had a new entry I didn't write. This time it said, Cell 14. Cell 14. Cell 14. Cell 14 was occupied. Inmate named Doss. I checked on him during the next count. He was asleep. Normal breathing. Nothing unusual. I flagged it in the log and moved on. 5 days later, Inmate Doss was transferred out of C block at his own request, citing persistent insomnia and what he described to the staff psychologist as a feeling of being observed from inside the walls. His transfer was approved without pushback. No one in administration asked follow-up questions. Third rotation. Same pattern. Ticking. Silence. Footsteps. Logbook entry I didn't write. This time the entry was longer, they did count in the dark. They stopped when we counted back. I read that sentence 6 times at the station under those yellow industrial lights. I read it until the words lost their meaning and then I read it again until the meaning came back different. I could not parse it. I still can't, entirely. But the word we sat in my stomach like a stone. Fourth rotation. March. My partner was DeMarco, who was the most experienced officer on our shift and had the kind of calm that comes from having seen enough bad things that very little registers anymore. We arrived at 11 p.m. Set up. Did the first count. Normal. Did the second count. Normal. At 1:45 a.m., DeMarco was at the station and I was on the ground floor, and I passed cell 22, the unoccupied cell Vasquez had originally reported sounds from, and I stopped. The cell door was open. Not ajar. Open. Swung fully inward, flat against the interior wall. The cell was dark. The bunk was bare. But on the steel frame of the bed, where there was no mattress and no bedding, there was an indentation. Not a physical indentation. The frame was solid steel, you couldn't press into it. But the shadow on the surface of the frame fell in a way that suggested weight. A long, narrow depression of shadow, roughly the length and shape of a human body lying on its side, as if the light from the corridor was being interrupted by something that wasn't there. I stood in the doorway of cell 22 for what felt like a very long time. I was holding my flashlight but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see if the shadow moved. I closed the door. I locked it with the manual key. I verified the lock by hand. I walked back to the station. 22 was open, I told DeMarco. He checked his keys. They were all on the lanyard. So were mine. Log it, he said. I logged it. At 2:20 a.m., the footsteps came again. Same pattern. But this time, they didn't stop above the station. They continued past it, along the Upper West Curve, getting fainter, and then they stopped somewhere I couldn't determine, and then, for the first and only time, I heard a cell door open on the upper tier. The sound was unmistakable. Steel on steel. The heavy drag of the hinge. I looked at camera 4. Upper West Corridor. The image was flickering badly, worse than usual. Every few seconds, the feed dissolved into static for a full second before reconstituting. In the gaps between static, the corridor appeared empty. But there was one frame, one single, frozen instant between two bursts of interference, where I saw a cell door on the upper west tier standing open, and inside the cell, barely visible in the dim yellow light, there was a figure sitting on the bunk. The image dissolved. Came back. The door was closed. The cell was dark. Everything was as it had been. DeMarco hadn't seen it. He was writing in the logbook. I didn't tell him. I want to tell you why I didn't tell him, because it matters for what happened later. It wasn't because I was afraid he wouldn't believe me. DeMarco had been doing this job long enough that he'd believe anything that was supported by pattern and evidence. It was because in that single frozen frame, the figure sitting on the bunk in the upper tier cell had been sitting the way inmates sit during count. Upright. Feet on the floor. Hands on knees. Facing the door. The posture of a person who knows someone is about to look through the slot and confirm they exist. It was being counted. Whatever was in C block, whatever walked the upper tier at night, whatever opened and closed doors that no one unlocked, whatever wrote in the logbook in handwriting that didn't belong to any living officer, it was conducting itself according to the rhythms and rituals of incarceration. It followed the schedule. It responded to count. It knew when we were coming and it presented itself in the way that inmates are trained to present themselves. And the protocols, the supplemental protocols that didn't have a form number or a department seal or a revision date, weren't designed to protect us from it. They were designed to prevent us from disrupting it. Don't go to the upper tier between 2 and 4 a.m. Don't investigate sounds from empty cells. Don't use the electronic systems. Don't leave the station alone. The protocols were a cohabitation agreement. I finished that rotation. I went home. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed in my apartment with the lights on and I listened to the ordinary sounds of a building at rest, the refrigerator cycling, the baseboard heater ticking, a car passing on the road outside, and I tried to convince myself that these sounds were categorically different from the sounds in C block. That the ticking in my walls was mechanical and the ticking in those walls was not. I was not successful. The next week, I requested a meeting with Warden Colton. He saw me in his office on a Tuesday afternoon. The office was small, carpeted, overlit. There was a framed photo of his family on the desk and a calendar from a local insurance company on the wall. It was the most aggressively normal room in the facility. I told him what I'd experienced. All of it. The footsteps, the logbook entries, the open doors, the camera feeds, the shape on the bunk. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he opened his desk drawer, took out a folder, and set it in front of me. Inside were photocopies of logbook pages. Dozens of them. Going back to the first week of C Block's reopening. Every third watch officer who had been assigned to that block had logged the same things. The same sounds. The same footsteps. The same logbook entries in handwriting nobody recognized. Some of the entries were short. 31+1. Cell 14. Some were longer. One read, "Morning count was wrong. Someone counted us twice." Another, "We are still here. The door is open but we are still here." "You've read all of these," I said. "Yes." "And you're not shutting the block down?" "With what justification? There's nothing on the cameras. There's no physical evidence of intrusion. Every count comes back correct. Every inmate is accounted for. The logbook entries are anomalous. And I've reported them upstate. They told me to continue operations under the supplemental protocols and monitor the situation. Who wrote the protocols? Colton looked at me. Not with evasion. With something worse. With the expression of a man who asked the same question and received an answer he could not repeat because it wasn't really an answer. They were included in the original facility documentation when C Block was sealed in 1978, he said. They were in the decommission file. Someone wrote them before the block was closed. They were written for whoever opened it again. Someone in 1978 wrote protocols for a reopening that didn't happen until last year. The protocols are not dated. There's no author listed. They were found in the file and they were implemented because they are specific and because, he paused. Because they work, Hadley. We follow them, and nothing escalates. Nobody gets hurt. The counts are correct. The block functions. What happened in C Block before it was closed? Former intake records for cell block C are archived off-site, he said. And the way he said it, toneless, automatic, I realized he was quoting protocol number 9. He'd memorized it. He'd said it before. I left his office. I went home. I did not request another C Block rotation. But I'll tell you what I did instead, and I'll tell you why I'm still thinking about it at night. 3 weeks after that meeting, a Thursday in late March, I was on B Block, doing my usual third watch. At around 1:30 a.m., I was at the east end of B Block's upper tier, which is the closest point in the facility to C Block's connecting hallway. There's a window there, a narrow, wire-reinforced pane that looks out onto a service corridor that runs between the two wings. Through that window, if you angle yourself right, you can see the fire doors to C Block. I looked through the window. I don't know why. Habit. Proximity. The pull of something I hadn't resolved. The fire doors were closed. The lights in the connecting hallway beyond them were their usual 1 in 3. Everything was normal. Then the lights went out. All of them. Every working fixture in the connecting hallway went dark simultaneously. The corridor beyond the fire doors was pitch black. And in the darkness, through the wire-reinforced glass, I saw the fire doors swing open. Slowly. Both of them. All the way open. Nothing came through. But the air did. That thin, dry, metallic scent reached me through the seams of the window, stronger than I'd ever smelled it. And with it came a sound, not the ticking, not the footsteps, but something I hadn't heard before. A low, sustained murmur, like many voices speaking at once at a volume just below comprehension. Not words. Not quite. A cadence. A rhythm. Like a count being conducted in a language I didn't know, by someone who had been doing it for a very long time, in the dark, without stopping, whether anyone was listening or not. The lights came back on. The fire doors were closed. The hallway was empty. I stood at that window for a long time. My breath had fogged the glass. Through the fog, I could see the faded sign on the fire door. Maintenance, no access. And the ghost of the smiley face, barely visible. I didn't report it. There was nothing to report. Everything was where it was supposed to be. The doors were closed. The lights were on. The counts were correct. That was 13 months ago. I'm still at Ridgemont. C Block is still operational. They've expanded it to 44 inmates now. The supplemental protocols have not been updated. Third watch officers still log the same phenomena, still follow the same procedures, still go home in the morning and sit in their cars in the parking lot for a while before driving. Pruitt quit in June. He didn't give a reason. He just stopped showing up. I heard he took a security job at a warehouse distribution center upstate. I don't blame him. The only thing that has changed, and I want to be precise about this, is the count. Last month, a third watch officer named Robles flagged something in the C Block logbook that Colton brought to a staff meeting. During Robles' 3:30 a.m. count, he confirmed 44 inmates on the lower tier. All present. All accounted for. But when he reviewed the logbook entry from the previous count, the 245, the total written in the book was not 44. It was 45. The handwriting was his own. He confirmed it. He'd written it himself, he said. He remembered writing it. He remembered counting 45 living bodies in 44 occupied cells and not stopping to consider why the number was wrong because the count felt right. He said it felt correct in the way that a thing you've done 10,000 times feels correct, automatic, below the level of thought, like breathing or blinking. He didn't know where the 45th person was. He couldn't remember which cell had contained the extra count. He just remembered that when he reached the end of the tier and tallied his marks, the number was 45, and he wrote it down, and he moved on. Colton didn't flag it upstate. He crossed out the 45, wrote 44, and initiated the correction. In the margin of the logbook, underneath the correction, in handwriting that didn't match Colton's, or Robles, or anyone else's, someone had written, "Thank you for counting us. I drive past Ridgemont every night on my way to shift." The building sits on a low hill behind a double perimeter fence, and from the county road you can see the east wing, where C Block is. The windows on that wing are narrow and dark, and at night, if you look quickly and then look away, you might think you see movement behind them. A shape passing. A light shifting. Something adjusting itself to the rhythm of a routine it has maintained since long before anyone remembered to ask why. I don't look anymore. I go in. I do my job. I follow the protocols. And when the air in the east corridor carries the thin metallic scent, I hold my breath until I'm past the fire doors, and I tell myself that whatever is being counted in cell block C is staying counted, and that the agreement, the one nobody signed, the one written in protocols that have no author and no date, is holding. I tell myself that every night. But last Thursday, I was at my station in B Block, doing a perfectly normal count on a perfectly normal tier, and when I finished and tallied my marks, the number was one higher than it should have been. I recounted. The number was correct the second time. But for a moment, for one automatic, below the level of thought moment, the wrong number had felt right. And I wonder, now, whether that's how it starts. Not with sounds. Not with footsteps. Not with doors that open on their own. It starts when the count feels right, and you stop asking why.